Hi. Okay. Yes, that's definitely a sound. All right. I really like this frame for examining differences in communication style because I feel like it can come up as a culture clash where there are tensions that come up when you're not aware that this may be going on, especially at work, which is something that I'll be sure to cover during this talk. And I think the thing is people can be really clear communicators often, but perhaps only with people that are similar to themselves in a way. And so what I would like to do is to help all of us try to get better at doing this, bridging across even with people that are different from ourselves in some way. But first, I wanted to explain a little bit about the 3 words and phrases that they asked us to describe ourselves with on the speaker page. These were my 3. That first one, strong, is because I have been training in weightlifting for most of this year, and I am super proud of the PRs I've been getting on bench press, back squat, and deadlift, and I am possibly interested in trying to find a gym here during this conference, so if you're interested, definitely let me know. I tried to do the conversion so that I'd be understandable most folks, but I think some of those numbers anyway are probably more than what some of you might weigh. So yeah, don't cross me. So that's the first one. The next one, brightly colored. I am just like really a big fan of bright colors in general. The t-shirt that I'm wearing today has a Harry Potter cartoon print on it, which is pretty amazing. I was pretty nervous looking at the lineup for this conference of just like, oh my God, there's like so many really cool people that are going to be here. I don't know why I'm necessarily here, but hey, the thing is I really love working in Ruby. I may not be the most expert, but I am definitely enthusiastic. I mean, how many of you have hair that matches Ruby? I just got those done last week. So I've got my red hair. And today I also have matching Ruby earrings, which you can come compliment me on later as well. They're just like little Ruby shapes there. And I just wanted to say that it's a really good thing that I packed these and not my pearl earrings instead. So great. That's what happens when you're on 3 different flights within a day. Okay, so, and then the last one here, curious. I am just curious about lots of things generally. Also, just a big fan of cats in general. The top photo there is a pano of my space at work, and what you see in the background are the result of this cat a day calendar that my friend Matt got for his birthday a few months ago. And so what we've been doing with those cat a day calendars is we are making what we are calling catlages. They are a collage, but for cats. I'm so glad the screen is so large. There's so many of them. We've just been doing this on Fridays for Arts and Cats time. And there's so many cats in there because I think you could say we have just a huge catalog. Thank you. I'm so excited. Okay. All right. So here's something I am curious about. I'm going to describe a situation, and I would love to know how you would respond to it. So here's what's up. Let's say this is you, and this is your friend, Jamie. And Jamie has a friend that you've never met named Taylor. So this is our cast of characters here. And Taylor is going to visit your city and needs a place to stay. But you would rather not host a stranger. I think that's perfectly understandable. So your friend Jamie asks you, can Taylor stay with you? Now, what's the instinctual reaction in your head? Not out loud, just in your head. Is it, oh, I'll just tell them no? Or is it something more like, ugh, this kind of puts me in a difficult position? So that was just a really quick litmus test. If you think it's not a big deal to just say no, you are most likely from ask culture. But if instead this situation would make you feel really uncomfortable, you're most likely from guess culture instead. So show of hands, who identifies more with ask culture here? Cool. Okay, and then guest culture on the other hand. Oh, wow. Okay, cool. And then if there are some undecideds in the audience, cool. All right. Well, that's totally cool. We're going to talk about it in excruciating detail here. So here's an overview of what I'm going to cover. And the first one here is just to talk a little bit more about the background of this idea. And so as far as I can tell, this particular ask versus guest culture terminology first came up on an Ask Metafilter post in 2007. And the way that it's described there is, in some families, you grow up with the expectation that it's okay to ask for anything because you're also okay with getting no for an answer. So this is the sort of general description of what ask culture is like. In other families, on the other hand, you avoid asking unless you're pretty sure that the answer is going to be yes. And the way that you do that is you extend out some delicate feelers so that hopefully, if done well, you don't even have to explicitly ask, you'll just get an offer. And even then, you have to consider, if you accept, are you possibly imposing too much on this person? You have to use your judgment. Were they just trying to be polite? And so really, guest culture is very much about the idea that putting others in the position of having to say no seems a bit rude. Now, this is definitely a spectrum, not a dichotomy. We could consider computers as the furthest extreme, where you have to spell out everything exactly. Based on my own experience, different regions in the United States, for one, are at different points along this scale. Yeah. And in general, I mean, places that have a really strong reputation for being a really nice place tend to be more guest culture. Globally, on the other hand, some countries seem to have a culture of being really direct, like some Germans that I know are in the audience here. While others might be considered a bit more indirect, perhaps like in Japan or something like this. And certainly individuals are going to vary by quite a bit. So this is not about stereotypes, but more about general patterns that we might see in the world. And one thing I do want to make clear is that even though I talk about this very much as one versus the other, I really mean that more in terms of comparing, contrasting, not that one is better or anything. Just because you feel more comfortable with one doesn't make it automatically better in all situations, nor for all people. And so I think this is very much along the lines of this theme of responsibility that Martin was just talking to us about, that I think you have responsibility in how your messages are received by other people. And those people might be different from you. One phrase that I really love that my boss shared with me once was that you should deal with reality on reality's terms. So while we might imagine an ideal world where everyone just gets along with no effort whatsoever, maybe you secretly think that your method of communication is an improvement. I think this culture framing can still be a useful heuristic, and it's very practical for understanding the other side. So we can go through a couple more examples right now. One I have heard it's from a Medium piece I read they called it the Seattle No. I have also heard of this referred to as the California Yes. Any Californians out there, you can tell me if this is legit or not. And so it goes something like this. Someone might say, hey, I'm going to this party, do you want to come? And if the answer is anything along the lines of, that sounds interesting, I'll have to check. Or, oh yeah, maybe. And then you just never hear from them again about this. It turns out that this means no. And my point is that this is not necessarily obvious to everyone, because for me, I would look at that. I'm a very literal person generally, and I would say, like, the word no wasn't in there at any point, but that was what was meant regardless. So here's another example from my personal life. So this is some setup for this particular anecdote. Normally on the weekend, my husband Dan and I each cook one big meal to have leftovers for the upcoming week, for me to bring into lunch or whatnot. And one weekend I was just sitting there saying out loud, I don't think I have time to make lunch for next week. So the thing is, I was just thinking through my weekend and just talking out loud that I would need to figure something else out. But my husband, Dan, what he heard there was, could you make some extra meals? And so then he, at a later point, brings up something like, oh yeah, I'm going to cook 2 meals this weekend. And I'm just thinking, okay, that's weird. He's planning to make a lot of food, but that's cool. I just completely was missing the signal he was sending out. This is what he would expect me to say if I wanted to refuse that offer and I had seen it as connected to the statement that I was making. So what happened then was, at the end of the weekend, I'm over here thinking, why do we have so much food in the fridge? And he's over there thinking, I'm such a good husband. This stuff comes up all the time. Oh, man. So I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of ask and guess cultures, because my aim is definitely to be as fair as possible to both. Ask culture, I think, really prioritizes efficiency in knowing exactly where you stand, because there's no ambiguity, no interpretation needed. It might be considered as something that transcends nationalities better, but one thing to note is that people who are guest culture do feel as though they have, in fact, clearly expressed their wishes, even if it's not explicitly laid out in their words. Another pro is that you do tend to get what you want, at least in the short term. But if you ask for a lot of things, maybe that doesn't necessarily always play out in the long term as much. Some of the cons that we might come up with here, though, is that it does tend to bring conflict out into the open a bit more. It can come across as even a bit confrontational at times and can end up making people feel uncomfortable, maybe even alienate them to some degree. Guest culture, on the other hand, very much prioritizes avoiding hurt feelings or embarrassment from those direct confrontations. And so, as a result, I think it's generally considered more polite. And it's very expressive. You can say a lot because of everything that's implied beyond the exact words that you're using. It does, however, depend on a really tight net of shared expectations. You have to be able to recognize those subtle signals that other people are sending and receiving. So this can be difficult if you're more like me and might have a hard time reading social cues at times. The other thing is that assumptions aren't all the same in all guest cultures, from the Midwest to the South or from country to country even. And if people don't share your expectations, you can end up feeling like no one is listening to you, potentially. Another way to take a look at this would be if you consider, if we were to chart some percentage of requests granted in ask versus guest cultures here, there's basically a different denominator that we're considering here, because there are both explicit and implicit requests going on, which can end up being a cause for resentment. And so one thing I would point out here is that if you are working with someone who tends to be more guest culture, if they do very explicitly ask for something, then that means that that is a really big deal and something to be paying attention to. Some further considerations here for people who might not be exactly sure which one they are just yet. Why is anyone the way that they are? It's a whole bunch of things all at once, right? Probably some innate preferences molded by your family, molded by whatever larger cultures that you might be in. I have a friend who is from Vancouver, Canada, which is a very diverse city with many different cultures there, and he was noting that he felt, as a result, folks that he knew from there leaned more ask culture because they don't have a history of shared expectations from a less diverse or kind of more culturally homogenous area. In the workplace, different companies certainly have different standards and cultures as well. I've been told that Intel is a very strongly ask culture, in that people will not ask you if you need help. You have to be the one that brings it up. Startups, on the other hand, can be much more loose. They can have much less processes. People can get to know each other better. But it can also depend on how fast they're trying to move, perhaps. If they're only trying to get things done in the short term, they might lean more in one direction. One thing someone suggested to me after last time I gave this talk was that remote work is something to consider in here as well. Since so much of our communication is very much around body language and and facial expressions, if you're only able to communicate through text or really delayed video technology of some kind, that can have an effect as well, I believe. Even within that, I think from team to team within the same company can have some variations. Kind of like having microclimates, I think you can have microcultures depending on who you're working with and interacting with on a regular basis. Because in the end, culture is really just a word for how we do things, and there's of course a lot of variation in how that happens. Maybe even some personal experiences that you've had that might push you one way or the other. So for example, my parents are immigrants to the US, and if you think about the kind of person that would go off to a foreign country on their own, barely even speaking the language, and then have a successful life for themselves, that could really shape a person and how they end up interacting and communicating with folks. One particular area, so speaking of family, I often hear things like, oh yeah, my mom is just like that, or my mother-in-law, it's so hard to tell what she wants. So, just completely anecdotally, I have this impression that women tend to be socialized to be more guest culture, more accommodating and less confrontational in some ways. There's this idea, I really like this phrasing, it's called the Girl Scout tax, which is there's often an expectation that women will be just by default more helpful, and so if you personally don't match someone's expectations, you might get labeled with something like abrasive. And on the other hand, there are folks who might consider that men who aren't as strongly ask culture can get labeled as timid instead. And it would be really great to be able to move on from those sorts of categorizations. I think in general, I try to have the attitude that people are just doing the best with what they know and how they're capable, and so if there's something that I can do to make it a better situation, that would be really great to take on. And so if at this point you still can't categorize yourself, I would generally say you are probably a guest culture person because you just don't want to say no to me. And non-jokingly, I feel that ask culture people tend to recognize this frustration in not understanding what it is that other people want from you. And oftentimes, I have just been told in many performance reviews, you're a really direct person. Yes, that's true. So, but again, it can be a matter of context as well, because some folks, you could very well be one way with your family, you all know each other very well, you have this shared experience to draw from, but maybe you're a different way with your friends or at work instead, because you have different goals in mind and behavior that you're trying to accomplish there. So different styles might be very much appropriate for different situations. I think related to that, there are certain situations where you're maybe not fully sure about what the relationship is. So on the one end, if you have an interaction with a stranger, it's brief, it's transactional, there's much less a long-term concern around the relationship. And on the other hand, if there are people that know you really well, they get you and you can kind of relax a little bit, perhaps, in the way that you are considering how you talk to them. But there's all this stuff in the middle, in this a little bit of an iffy gray zone, because I think of this often when you've become friendly with someone at work, and I have a question of are you making that leap into friends outside of work as well? Do they like you as much as you like them? Would you be hanging out on the weekends voluntarily, even if you ended up leaving this job and whatnot? And in those kind of hazier situations, of course, you don't want to be causing embarrassment either to yourself or to the other person there. So now let's talk about some more concrete strategies for handling these ask to guest situations and vice versa. You can definitely live in harmony. My husband and I are very much on the opposite ends, and we have been together for over 10 years now, 13 years something. It's kind of a long time. And I'd say that generally speaking, it's about trying to step a bit more into the other culture so that your message is clear and people are comfortable. And now that you can at least recognize the difference, you're most of the way there, I'd say. So if you're from Ask Culture, the number one tip I have is to just make a guest culture friend who can be a guide and interpreter for you. So this is what my husband Dan is for me a lot of the times. If I'm confused by some interaction, I'll probably bring it home and he'll help me dissect it to see what was being said between the lines. Sometimes I'll even just send him difficult emails that I want to write and hash it out with his feedback to figure out how I can rephrase something so that I'm getting my message across in a more acceptable manner in those situations. One thing to remember is that it is not just what people say, but what they don't say as well, because it might not have been a no, but maybe it wasn't an enthusiastic yes either. So just try to pay attention when there might be some hesitation there. And then lastly, it happens that we make mistakes and something doesn't come across the way that we intended. So just apologize and clarify later if you realize a bit late that what you said could be misinterpreted, that you sent out some sort of guest culture signal that wasn't what you intended. So if you're from guest culture, on the other hand, anytime I'm practicing this presentation and I ask my husband for advice, he's always kind of like, guest culture people don't need to hear this. They already understand this. You don't have to be so explicit and direct all the time. But I don't really like to leave things unbalanced too much, so just a couple quick points. One thing here is that if you're angry or frustrated with someone because it seems like they're in your face all the time, remember that they might be unaware of the rules that you are taking for granted as a shared understanding. So it might just take some education to bring them on board. Consider also that softening a no with an excuse can end up hurting people as well. And I know that that's really the fundamental underlying goal for a lot of folks there is wanting to preserve social harmony. And so one thing to consider there is that if they didn't understand that what you said was a no, that can lead to more confusion down the line. So I'm going to talk a little bit now then about how this frame applies to certain work situations where that culture clash might come up. Some general items to consider are, we have a lot of short-term goals that we need to get done at work, get the story in, get the feature in, get the demo done for this week, but we have to remember that there are long-term effects on those relationships as well. It's kind of like investing or letting technical debt linger and having it be rotting away in some portion. You want to do a better job of trying to build those relationships there. One item that helped me was to try to be a bit more deferent until that relationship has been established, because when you have a friendly relationship, people are much more likely to interpret what you say in a favorable light. Like, oh, that's just how Keiwu is. She wasn't saying that you need to hurry. She was just curious about, where you're at so she could figure out how she could help in those situations. You could do some check-ins outside of times when you need something right then so that people understand, it's a broader picture that you're taking a look at. One question to ask yourself is, are you really sure you know what other people are thinking? How much of it is something that you're assuming based on what you think you heard? And in general, I think it's a good idea to assume that you may not know necessarily. So, and this goes both ways. For one, don't assume that other people will react the way that you would react, but also don't assume that they're unhappy with you either. You don't have to continually second guess what's going on, even if people mention things just more than one time. Again, kind of back to the idea of assuming that you may not know necessarily. Some useful phrases that I have generally come up with include, hey, I have a question, but it's totally okay to say no. So this is something that I'll say before I ask someone for something, just saying up front and reminding them it's okay to say no if they can't take this on right now. And I think that this can work for guest culture folks as well, because you can use this to remind yourself that other people can say no to you if you're feeling uncomfortable about something that you have to ask at work. And I've learned that this actually can be further improved thanks to some expert guest culture friends that I practice this talk with again. So we can replace that second part of the phrase with something like, I have a question, but it's okay if you're busy, or I understand if you're busy, because it's a bit more empathetic and helping people find a way to decline more gracefully. Sometimes I'll just be kind of go overboard and say something like, hey, I have just an observation I want to make, but it's definitely not a judgment. Please tell me more. I'm just really curious about what's going on. And hopefully people can sense the sincerity with which I'm expressing that. Another phrase that people can use is to try to call back to previous conversations. So this particular one happened with a friend of mine who wanted to ask for a raise after she got a bunch of new responsibilities. And this way, this was feedback that she had gotten in her last performance review right before then, and it helped set it up to be a situation where she was much more comfortable going forth and asking for that raise. So I think it's important to try to practice saying those words if that's not something that you're typically accustomed to doing. I also really like to try to discuss communication styles. With every new manager I have this conversation, try to have it up front, and tell them that I need to hear words pretty literally and directly in order for me to get the message. If you wanted to bring this up in other conversation, you could also say, kind of lay it out in advance. If your boss is saying, hey, I'd really love for you to speak up in meetings a lot more often, you could offer back, it would really help if such and such situation. Like, instead of having to fight your way into the conversation, if there was more of a round table where everyone was already predetermined to ask for their opinion at least once before other people start talking a second, third, fourth, fifth time. I'm kind of an offender of that sometimes. Anyway, another tactic is you can use this talk as an excuse once you get back to your day jobs and whatnot. So, for example, you could say something like, I went to this amazing talk at RubyConf Portugal this past week. I'm just saying, that's a suggestion. All right, let's talk about a couple more example situations. I think one area where this can come up a lot is in trying to receive or give help to other folks. And so this can be something to discuss with a team and with mentors in particular when establishing that relationship. Before it's needed, you can talk about things like how to interrupt, frequency of checking in, how much time that you should let yourself get stuck before people are expecting you to speak up. And then that hopefully will make it a smoother interaction because you can reference that initial conversation. So, for example, I've talked to some junior engineers who say things like, I'm not sure I understand this feature. And what's happening here is that they are saying this hoping that people will see that they don't understand what's going on and step up to offer that help instead. So this can be totally effective. You don't have to change this if you're getting what you need. But if you are not getting those offers of help, it could be that people are missing your signals and do want to help, but need a bit more explicit direction around that. On the other hand, just because no one has specifically said, this is not working for me, doesn't mean that everything's okay. It's good to ask questions very gently, but again, don't assume that you necessarily know what's going on. So sometimes I'll end up pairing conversation with something like, do you have any questions for me? And this is okay. I'm trying to give an opening for people to bring things up, but it might be better phrased as something like, what questions do you have for me? And laying that groundwork and trying to, again, be a bit more gentle about soliciting that information. You could also say something like, hey, we have a few options that work, A, B, and C. Let me know what you might prefer. So people don't have to decline any of them necessarily, and you can also be really enthusiastic when you're offering all of these potential solutions. One particular situation I think is good to be wary about is if you are an ask culture person managing a guest culture person. Because if you want them to take something on, but you want them to also be comfortable saying no to you when it's not appropriate, this is something that needs a lot of positive reinforcement because of this power differential that's in there. You have to be really careful of setting up a situation where it feels like an illusion of choice, because if you say it's okay to say no and they say no and then you reverse that decision, that happens, no worries, but it's better to have some more explanation you can give behind that, because you don't want to end up in a situation where they end up never saying no to you again, even if you want them to have accurate information to better manage your team. Also, try not to default to processes where people have to ask, because that can end up penalizing some folks. So for example, if you had a conference travel policy where people always have to bring it up themselves and make a case for it necessarily, it might just end up being that only certain folks end up going to all the conferences, and it's not more equitable in some way. And so finally, if you have a report that you think is mostly guest culture and who rarely makes direct requests, again, if they do, it's just something to be really good to try to pay attention to. And the last general area I'll cover in this section on work situations is trying to just use your strengths for the situation as it's called for. So for example, in meetings, if you're a guest culture type person, maybe you should enlist an ask culture person that will help advocate for your point of view if you want to get that point across, but you're feeling that it's a more confrontational setting. And on the other hand, there are plenty of times when folks at work have really helped me out because they're stepping in because they know the situation needs a slightly different approach. So the final thought that I'd want to really leave you with is to just be thoughtful and try to help each other out. Ask culture people, now that you know, just because you wouldn't be offended or feel squished doesn't mean that other people wouldn't be either. And so you can be thoughtful and be the one to call that out, to help carve out space for all of us, for everyone to be able to feel comfortable and accomplish all our hopes and dreams. And so this is a topic that I am a little obsessed with, and I love to talk to people about it. So if you ever have any questions for me about it, please just ask. Thank you.